Antoinette here with another video. Hope everyone is doing well. If you enjoy my content, please like and subscribe. It helps me build a channel. I'm up to 126 subscribers, and I thank everyone who's subscribed. And I'm hoping to get up to 200 by sometime in April. We'll see how it goes. Anyway, thanks for everyone who subscribed. Okay, this is on, my last video was on Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. This video will be on my experiences with the Trotskyist left. I've been in two different Trotskyist organizations, one for like 3 months, another one for something over 10 years. And I was close to another organization for, I don't know, between roughly around 9 months, 6 to 9 months. I'm not really sure how to calculate. I'm not currently affiliated with any group right now. I know what's out there. I have disagreements with most other groups. I think they've gone way off the rails. I got to preface this by saying that most people in these organizations are really wonderful people. I don't mean any of this on a personal attack on people, but I do have criticisms of organizations. Here it goes. Okay, so when I was in Socialist Alternative, and I really miss being in an organization, they had these summer camps or camp outs, which I actually miss. One of the things would people would gather around the campfire and people would talk about how they became a socialist. And most people, it was something like, they were caught up in the capitalist dystopia of the U.S. and healthcare. The families had healthcare problems affording healthcare. Families had financial problems, stuff like that. And that's how they would realize how horrible U.S. capitalism was firsthand. In my case, it was a little like that, but it was also a much more complicated, drawn out process. I kind of regarded myself on the left from a little kid. Kind of complicated. Okay, my dad was a great guy. He passed away in 2011, June 1st of 2011 of cardiac congestion. I miss him. I still have imaginary conversations with him. When we used to talk at the dinner table about history and politics and geopolitics and world events, he always had always had lots of books, and half of those books are from my dad, the other half are from me. That's only like 1/5 of my entire book collection. The rest is like packed away. But anyway, we used to talk about this stuff at the dinner table. And my dad was always like an odd mixture of left and right. Like, he'd really talk about the corruption of corporate America, how corrupt big businesses were, and how corrupt the government was, and the distribution of wealth and things like that. But he was also really big on law and order, and he loved the police, and we need more crackdowns. He hated illegal immigrants. He would go into, it was like odd. He hated war, but he hated people who protested war even more. Odd mixture of things. My dad went through a stage. He was very anti-communist. He had, I read Solzhenitsyn in 1984 and all that stuff. But my dad actually went through a stage later on. He was kind of sympathetic to the Soviet Union. I don't know. Well, my dad was like an odd mixture of things. Anyway, I have a younger sister. I took some of the more left-wing ideas of my dad and kind of ran with it. My sister took more of the right-wing ideas of my dad and went with that. I have a younger sister. She's always been much more conservative than I was. Okay, so my dad had books that he had were books by, he had these books from the 60s. One was by Abby Hoffman, Steal This Book by Abby Hoffman. He had Revolution for the Hell of It by Jerry Rubin, a couple other similar books. And I read those and I was like, wow, that was really exciting. Like, I was bummed out that I missed out on. For a long time growing up, I was really bummed out that I missed out on the 60s. Kind of sounded like a really great time to be alive, really exciting stuff going on. When I came of age, there wasn't much going on. So I really missed out on the 60s. I read this book. So I came across this book in high school. My parents gave it to me for a birthday present. I asked for it. It was at this bookstore when we were living in Vermont. It was called Revolution. It was called The Radical Soap Opera by David Zane Moyerowitz. I have it in my bookcase. I can't find it, but it's by David Zane Moyerowitz, a New York City playwright. Despite the radical soap opera, despite the title, it's kind of from a leftist perspective. It's from a leftist perspective, a somewhat cynical, warped review of it, but it's basically a history of the radical movements of the 60s and some of their prehistory and where things might go. It's a cool. I read like 3 times in high school. I went 3 different times, and I was like really intrigued by that. Talk about all the famous events of the '60s, the Chicago demonstration, the development of the SDS, and all that kind of stuff. Like, wow, it's really cool. Sometime later, a library book, I came across a couple of books by a guy named Ray Mungo. It was called Total Loss Farm, and he had several others. He lived in a commune in southern Vermont, like Putney, Vermont, I think. And I read those books. It was kind of a history of the '60s movements from his own perspective. Kind of interesting. I was really attracted to that kind of stuff and really bummed out that I missed out on it. We moved around a lot, went to like two different high schools in Long Island, New York, and two different high schools in Vermont. I hated high school. Bullied a lot. I really fucking hated high school. I still dislike the American public school system, even though I'm working in a school district right now. Okay, so I had this one school I went to in Vermont, East Montpelier, Vermont. An English teacher, I'll give his name, Gene Novogratsky. He was a socialist. I don't know what tendency or what take, but he used to talk about it. And one time he would sometimes take a bunch of us to see foreign films like Fellini. So Amarcord by Fellini about the fascist in Italy. Really interesting. A couple of things. And we used to talk with him. Interesting guy. I don't know what tendency he was, but he had a friend, another teacher. By the way, at the school, you could call teachers by their first names. Another teacher called Stewart. Actually, he was a science teacher. I've forgotten his last name, if I ever knew it. They were both socialists. And we were in the hiking club, and Stewart and Gene Amagrotsky, we'd go hiking, and a bunch of other kids. And they talk about, Gene and Stewart talk about the Russian Revolution, the Great Russian Revolution. And I was surprised, like first time I came across a favorable view of the Russian Revolution. Like generally idea I had then was like socialism is good. I knew about Eugene Debs and the IWW, but communism was bad. The Russians were really bad. I read Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago, 3 volumes. I read Animal Farm and 1984 and all that kind of stuff, and kind of indoctrination. And they're the classics. They do have a lot to offer, but the standard anti-communist indoctrination everyone gets in the U.S. But I was a bit surprised. I was kind of moving to the left, but I was kind of a bit surprised. So I talked things over with Gene. He was the first like real socialist I met. Okay, and I regard myself on the left, moving more and more towards the left. Long story, when I was in college, I was in a couple different affinity groups. I didn't encounter like the socialist left until quite a while later. A long story, I'm condensing a lot of stuff, but I took time off from college and went back. One time I went to the University of Vermont, UVM, and they had these boxes full of like underground newspapers, like the Vanguard, the Guardian, or it used to be a National Guardian, which was a radical newspaper, which folded in the 1980s, I think. I read back issues of it, really intriguing, all this radical literature, really intriguing. One time a librarian scolded me for reading it. Fast forward, I took time off from school. I worked for a bookstore, Dartmouth bookstore in Hanover, New Hampshire. I had no connection with Dartmouth College. I hated Dartmouth. It was like a bro culture was really big there. Like you're all working for frat bro types. They were all going to work for the finance sector. I hated those people, very arrogant and elitist. But the Dartmouth bookstore, when I first got there, was really interesting. Tons of books. One of my coworkers was a guy named John Wing. He came from Maine, young guy in his early 30s, I guess. He looked like John Lennon. He had the beard, Coke bottle glasses, hair down to his shoulder. Interesting guy. He was a Marxist of some sort. I don't know what. And he was worked at the information desk of the bookstore, and he used to sell Noam Chomsky books. Like people would very often come into the bookstore, ask for a book on U.S. foreign policy, and he'd sell them Noam Chomsky. Like he had his books, Chomsky at that time, his book, The Political Economy of Human Rights, Volume 1 and 2, and he used to sell them to people. And I picked up that John did this as a form of activism, and the books, I borrowed those books. You can borrow books. I took them home, and it was a fierce criticism of U.S. imperialism, and I kind of knew about that. I read it over a couple of weeks. I knew about this before somewhat, but this put in the graphic detail, all the horrible things the U.S. did in Southeast Asia, was doing in Central America, so many other. I just made my blood boil reading and like rage about fierce rage about U.S. imperialism, horrible fucking things that we're doing and still doing. And I picked up John Wing was doing this as a form of activism, and I started doing this myself. I started like selling Noam Chomsky books to people, and I got pretty good at it actually. John and I joke we should ask Chomsky for a commission for selling his books, and I read a bunch of others books. The Manufacture of Consent with Ed Herman, a bunch of other stuff. The New Mandarins, the Fateful Triangle, tons of others. And I went to a stage I was a huge Chomsky fan. I'm not so much now. Sometime later, I found out that many actually socialists pretty much hate Chomsky. I was initially surprised, but I told him Chomsky is now he's total shit lib. I really hate the guy myself, but I went through a stage he was a hero. Okay, when I was at the Dartmouth bookstore, I had John Wing had a friend of his named Abe Asherhoff, older guy, who was a veteran of the Spanish Civil War. He was a big guy. He was a big beard. He was a carpenter. He had a house in LA and he had a house in Etna, New Hampshire, which he built himself. He was also a filmmaker. And I used to see him around a lot, and I went to a couple of parties at his house, and that was kind of, he was friends with a Spanish leftist. That was kind of my introduction to more of the radical left in some ways. It was really intriguing. I have no idea. I doubt any of these people were Trotskyists exactly. I kind of doubt that, but it was really interesting. They were definitely Marxist. They were definitely interesting talking to them. They had friends in John and Abe Ashraf had friends in Central America and Nicaragua. It was really intriguing. Okay, long, complicated story. I went back to school at Keene State College in New Hampshire. There was a teacher, a professor there, Joan Rolfes, right, who was a Marxist of some sort. She retired. She has articles in Counterpunch magazine once in a while. She has left green group, like more to the left wing than most green groups are. And she had this class called Revolutionary Women. I asked her if I could audit it, and I did. Really intriguing. And I ran into Rosa Luxemburg and my other Revolutionary Women. And I audited the class. I sat in, really, really interesting. Oh, somewhere around the time I read the biography of Rosa Luxemburg by Paul Froelich, classic biography. First time I encountered like socialist theory. There's debates like Kautsky and Rosa and stuff, like really intriguing. And I was kind of gradually getting into this. Okay, anyway, I was on and off in a couple different affinity groups and local activist groups. I wasn't yet a member of a socialist organization, but okay. Well, a complicated story. I graduated from school. I couldn't find a job. I had a couple jobs. I moved back in with my parents for a while. Then I got a job overseas, and I'm condensing a lot. I lived for 6 years outside the US. I loved it. I was in China for 2 years. Then I was in Moscow, Russia for a little over 3 years. And my time in China was like the happiest time of my life. I skipped over a lot of stuff. A therapist I later saw once said, she thought that might have been, I was there in those countries subconsciously because they were communist, or, Russia wasn't communist anymore, and it's debatable if China was, but they were the communist countries. And, it might have been some psychological. I was interested in communism, like in an abstract sense. I read about 3 biographies of Che Guevara. I read Todd Schultz biography of Fidel. I was kind of intrigued by communism. Don't even completely know why. Okay, so fast forward. I was overseas for about 6 years and backpacking. I spent a year backpacking around Europe and stuff. I came back to the States, moved back in with my parents, couldn't find a job. Long, complicated story. I was under a lot of frustration. I was kind of not in a stable situation. I have a master's degree. And I spent a lot of time around the world, but I couldn't find a job at all. I tried very hard. Eventually, I ended up 2004. I ended up in the Boston area. For a while, I was like couch surfing and stuff, but I got a job. I got a job at a call center, and I was there for something over 2 years. I'm going to talk about that for a minute. It was fundraising for liberal nonprofit organizations. It sounds better than it was. It sounds better. It sounds better than it was. Parties. I told people what I did. I raised money for nonprofits. People were impressed. Like, wow. But the job wasn't as good as it sounds. Okay, we fundraised for environmental groups, Sierra Club, World Wildlife Fund, the Friends of the Earth, PETA, animal rights groups, PETA. They're odd group. People call PETA like people eating, tasting animals. PETA, the Humane Society of the U.S., Planned Parenthood, ACLU, LGBT groups like Gay and Lesbian Task Force, Gay and Lesbian Advocates and Defenders, the HRC, Human Rights Campaign, who was a big famous gay rights group, but a bunch of other groups. Gay Men's Health Crisis was one. Humane Society. We did Democratic Party too, campaigns, 04 presidential campaigns, different, we'd fundraise for that, and Democratic Party groups, the DCCC, Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee was one, the DSCC, and a couple others, PBS statewide, PBS, NPR, stuff like that. These groups were all Planned Parenthood. These groups were all kind of unofficial. I didn't pick it up at the time, but they were unofficial parts of the Democratic Party. Okay, so I first couple of months I was really, what we did is everyone got a cubicle, and we started we had a mic and a headset, and the calls would be computer generated. We wouldn't dial, the calls would be computer generated. They come up on a screen. We have to read off a script. Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. I hope you're doing well. I want to thank you very much for your past support. Blah blah. We go through the spiel, and we could jazz it up. We'll add stuff onto it, and everyone, like when they got in, that we did these campaigns, like they last for a day, a couple days, a week, couple of weeks. The company would contract with some organization. We of course keep a big chunk of what was raised. They'd contract us, and how you did, they put you on different campaigns depending on what your numbers were. It was like a sales job. And my coworkers were, most of them, you've seen the movie I think it's by the Cohen brothers, Glenn Gary, Glenn Ross, about sleazy real estate dealers in Chicago. It was kind of like that. My coworkers, most of them were salespeople. It's another movie, kind of forget the name of it. It's, I think it's called Diner. It's like a subculture of people in Baltimore in the 50s, 1950s, who sold aluminum siding. It was kind of like, very much like that. Some of my coworkers who've been there for years, like 20 years, the OG, the old gang, they regard themselves, some of these people, as like telephone activists. Like the company, it was called Share Group. It was in the Boston area. They moved a couple times. University was in Somerville, then they moved to West Newton. It's called the Share Group. They had left-wing origins. It was started, I don't know, early 70s by a guy named Michael and Sarah, who he was part of this Reform Teamsters group. And I forget who was in charge in the 80s, like this reform group in the Teamsters. And apparently he went to jail. He did some insider trading on the stock market to use money, to get money for this Teamsters reform group. It totally failed, blew up in his face. He did some time in jail. There's a book by the leftist filmmaker John Sayles, who did Madawan and Return of the Secaucus 7. John Sayles has this book, which I haven't read it, called Union Dues. It's about the left in Boston, the left in the early 1970s. Michael and Sarah is a figure in this. Okay, so his company, Share, he started Share. I started it. It was called Mass Fair Share, Massachusetts Fair Share, like a fundraise for these progressive groups. Part of it was sold off. It was split. He sold the whole thing. Michael and Sarah himself married some wealthy woman in Toronto, and he's living there. I met him once. He came back. He was like, I don't know what he was doing. He came back and wandered around the call center for a time, and he was a nice guy. He was a short guy, a really nice guy. I don't know. But the Share Group, they were supposed to be a progressive company. There's no such thing as a progressive company, but they billed themselves as a progressive company. Their slogan was the Share Group, where the phone lines are the front lines of social change. And some of my coworkers, not all of them, but some of the older ones, seriously regard themselves as telephone activists, which is kind of nonsense. But okay, now it sounds really good on the surface. I very quickly got really cynical about what we did. Very, very cynical. Humane Society was, interestingly, we used to call it the Humane Society. They're one of the most, they're a scam. Total scam. There's a website called Charity Navigator, which rates nonprofits, charities, how effective they are. And Humane Society is extremely low. Like very little of the money that's raised that people give them actually go towards like helping animals or whatever they're supposed to do. Their rate is extremely low. The CEO is a guy named Wayne Pacelli. He anglicized his name to Wayne Parcells. Wayne Parcells and board directors, they make six-figure salaries. Very, very little of what the money they raise actually goes towards helping animals. They have a really bad reputation. Okay, their target demographic, though, would be like little old ladies, literally elderly women in the South and the Midwest. They, the ads, they see these TV ads for, daytime TV ads about the play of animals, which I am a big animal lover. My dog Molly's sitting right next to me here. I'm a big animal lover, but, they push these ads, and somebody would, send in a check or send in some money with their phone number. Okay, with Humane Society, once they got your phone number, they would not ever stop calling you. It's their policy that they never take anyone off their phone list. You'd have to get a new phone number. They never, ever, ever take anyone off their phone list. So what we do in calling up these people, we do a sustainer pledge. Like, and you have to do it with a debit card or a credit card, or whatever, because if they sent in money by mail, after a few months, they just stop doing it. So we'd say to them, Mrs. Smith, could you do like $2 a month to help the animals? I know, sure, no problem. And okay, and your $2 small sustainer pledge in like a month or so later, can you do just an extra $1? And we raise $3, and month after month, gradually increasing. So it could be like to 12 or something. I think the peak was $15 a month. And, if we asked them right away if they could do $15 a month, of course, they would say no, but you gradually increase it. And, they're stuck on this. Then it could be given $15 a month. Then we'd have them do a second sustainer pledge, which only worked if they forgot they were doing a first sustainer pledge. And since they were elderly, they often did. So we'd give them up on a second sustainer pledge. And before you know it, they were giving like $30 a month. And I felt it was really unethical, to say the least. I mean, some of these people were just barely getting by. They were kind of abused or not treated well. And, they bond to animals. People don't treat me well, but animals give you unconditional love. I get that, actually. But, we milk them for all they're worth. And, see, some of these people, the last thing they should be doing is sending money to the Humane Society. I turned down a couple times, somebody offered to give $100. No, it's okay. I kind of deliberately screwed up calls sometimes. Just the last thing these people should be doing. But that's what we did. And one point they started doing a third sustainer pledge. They stopped doing it. That would have been a little too much. So a few of my fellow callers were a little nervous about calling for the Humane Society because it's like a scandal waiting to happen. There's so much sleazy stuff going on behind the scenes. So don't ever give any money to a nonprofit over the phone. Okay, and the supervisors were increasingly abusive. They were supposed to be progressive companies. No, they were nasty and abusive. There was a contact driven. You have to make a certain number of contacts per hour, whatever, and they keep people on the phones. They time how long you're in the bathroom. They were just, some of the managers were just outrightly nasty and jerks. I would kind of ham it up a little. The first couple of months I kind of had fun. It became extremely boring, monotonous, repetitive. I was stuck there. I couldn't find a job. I just fucking hated the place. But I would kind of goof around. I have a really sarcastic sense of humor. And I would kind of goof around, like I'd call up someone and say, oh, the animals are gonna die. Please send us money. They're all gonna die. I would do it just like that. Sometimes at work, people would send in money, but some of my coworkers would look at me like, who the hell is this person? They would get a little pissed off at me. And the managers started targeting me. I was harassed and bullied a lot by the managers. Long, complicated story. I've written about it for my blog someday. Sometime I might make a video on some of my experiences there. Oh yeah, there's an incredible amount of office politics. I mean, every place has office politics, but this has a huge amount of office politics. Not just with the management, with the callers. There are people, especially people who have been there for a year. There are these factions and cliques, and there are about 200 people work there in like 3 different shifts. And there's factions and cliques, and people would stab each other in the back, or one group would try to sabotage another. I had a low-level PTSD from that place. It was so fucking weird. Anyway, some good things about it though. I had a couple of coworkers who I made really good friends with. We were not like a mainstream, but some really good friends with a few coworkers there. One guy was named Bob. I'll give his name, Bob Kahanian. Really interesting guy. Lost touch with him. Older guy in his 60s. Really cool guy. He was a Trotskyist. And we talked. He was a film buff. He was maybe a little bit of my friend John Wing. I knew at the bookstore years earlier. He was older. Bob was an interesting guy. I don't know if he graduated from high school, but he was literally the most well-read person I've ever known in my life. He knew a lot about history, philosophy, political theory. He was a huge film buff, like Criterion Collection film buff. Amazing, interesting guy. And we used to talk. And, he struck a chord with me. This guy's he's one of the people we're really interesting to hang out with. Bob as I said, we called for Democratic Party campaigns. Bob convinced me not to. And, I knew the Democratic Party was corrupt. I thought, hey, we got to get rid of Bush. Bush is horrible. But, the Democrats suck. But Bob convinced me that, no, the Democratic Party is the enemy, the politics of lesser evilism. The Democrats co-opted marginalized groups. There's no accountability. This was well before like Sanders or AOC, but it was totally predictable what their trajectory would be, that they would turn to garbage. It's totally predictable. There are no progressive Democrats. The Democratic Party is your enemy. They lower class consciousness. And I had, Socialist understands. Bob explained this to me, and he's right. So you can do, if you have like at that job, the call center, if you had a moral objection to making a call, you could sign something, you could like resign from the call. And I did. I said, I did write a short essay that I have moral objections to calling for the Democratic Party. And some of the supervisors were kind of surprised. One person said to me, look at me, Kate, are you a communist? I said, yeah, I am. Mouth dropped open. I just did not do Democratic Party calls. And some people were really surprised by that. Okay. And Bob had a big influence on me. We talked for a while. Bob was a Spart sympathizer. Now, a little bit, the Sparts or the Spartacus League, they're like they're like an extremist Trotskyist group. They hate to be called Sparts. They consider it an insult, but whatever. Bob was not a member, but he was a sympathizer, and he talked about them. He subscribed to their newspaper as a Workers' Vanguard, and a little while I subscribed to it. I read it, and it was interesting. And we talk now. The Spartacus League are batshit crazy. I'll talk about them a little bit later, but I still have enormous respect for Bob. I learned a lot from him. Kind of my early political mentor, I guess. I learned a lot from Bob. I wasn't a big fan of the Sparts. I talk about them a bit later. They were weird, but a huge amount of respect for Bob. I would read Workers' Vanguard. I take it home. One time, they had returned the time there was the North Korea nuclear crisis and stuff going on. There's a late Bush administration, and I was at this union rally in Boston Common. I saw this guy, union guy, reading it, walking. He was reading Workers' Vanguard. I heard him say, he threw it to the ground and said, what the hell is this shit? That's the reaction you would get from people. I had friends come over who would read the thumb through Workers' Vanguard. One friend said, these people are disturbed. Yeah, I mean, they're Spartacus League, they're confrontational. One of their headlines in their paper said, defend North Korea's right to nuclear weapons. And I kind of see their point. Nuclear weapons are the reason why North Korea is not like Libya or Iraq, but the way they present it. Okay, anyway, so Bob was really well. My friend Bob gave me his dog-eared copy. There's a famous book by Isaac Deutscher, a biography of Leon Trotsky. 3 volumes. Is like the Prophet Arm, the Prophet ENX. I forget the titles. I have it here. The really dog-eared copy of it. I've read it. And he gave it to me. Wow. And it's controversial. Isaac Deutscher is controversial within the Trotskyist movement. He was a Polish Trotskyist, moved to the UK, became an academic, and an interesting guy. He's kind of a Trotskyist who's kind of close to Stalin in some ways. And a lot of Trotskyists actually hate this book, or series, but I thought it was at least very compelling. It's exciting, drew me in. Wow, it's like one of these books like everybody should read, anybody in life should read when they're 15. Tarika Lee actually said it was a life-changing book, even though it may have some inaccuracies and some odd conclusions. It was, okay, and I was hooked. bunch of things came together around that time. There was, of course, in fact, I mentioned I was after the Iraq War was going on. There's a lot on and off of ferment. There were huge protests, and Boston's a college town, so there were lots of protests everywhere. Huge center of anti-war activity, and I went to as many demonstrations as I could. There was stuff going on. It was time of the Democratic National Convention in '04, and everybody hated everybody in Boston. Like working class people hated it, just wanted to get out of Boston while that was going on. No one really liked the Democratic Party. Nobody had an alternative to it. I picked up on read socialist papers. They were basically free. Workers' World. I read that. It was free at like the Cambridge Co-op. Used to read that. The Revolutionary Worker, and then this revolutionary, the RCP. Revolutionary Communist Party. They were like a Maoist group. They were a cult group around their leader, Bob Avakian. And it was fun. It was interesting to read. MIM, Maoist International Movement. They were batshit crazy. They were just like what's called Maoist Third Worldist. They thought the Western working class was totally sold out, and they had this like the spelling was trippy. They would spell like United States of America was the United Snakes of America with 3 Ks, and Canada was Clannadia. They thought all sex under patriarchy was rape. I mean, they were just batshit crazy. But I thought, I was looking around for a socialist group. I used to read the Boston Phoenix. I work. You could read stuff. It was, Boston Phoenix had one article on commie groups in Boston, and I was looking for one. I traced down. I looked for from Bob's influence and from a bunch of influences. I thought I wanted to join a communist group or a socialist group. I was looking around for one, and I traced down. They had the I looked for a Socialist Workers Party, had an office in East Boston. I tried to find it. I kind of got lost, couldn't find it. Probably it's good, probably just as well. I started going to meetings of the Communist Party. They had a group in Cambridge on Mass Ave, closer to MIT by the and they had it's called the Marxist Education Center. I went to the China study group. People talk about China. I lived in China, so they're cool, interesting. I started going there. I gave a couple of reports to them. I was never a member of the Communist Party. I, didn't like Stalin. I was aware of the Stalin-Trotsky split. I didn't like Stalin, but I was kind of intrigued. They were the Communist Party, CPUSA. They were Dongists. They were very pro, like Deng Xiaoping. They were very pro-China. And it was kind of interesting. I didn't really agree with them, but the talks were really interesting. A lot of people there kind of thought I actually was a member of the Communist Party, but I wasn't. Okay, so what happened is really complicated. I saw a small, I think after one of the Bush's troop surge, I don't remember the troop surge, there were another wave of protests in Boston. In front of where I worked, there was protests. There were a bunch of people protesting. And this young woman had a sign from a group called Socialist Alternative. And it gave their website. And I talked to her. I went to talk, hey, what do you guys do? I said, no, we have meetings. We talk about the Russian Revolution in China. Oh, so cool. How can I contact you guys? How can I join? Well, she referred me to their website. It's on their website, URLs on the sign. Okay. Kind of interesting thing is I never saw this woman again. I remembered what she looked like, and later on, much later, I joined Socialist Alternative finally, and I asked people about this woman. No one ever heard of her. Like, she might not even remember she was holding the sign. I have no idea what was going on. I never could figure out who she was. But okay, so I looked up their website. They have a contact form if you're interested and you can meet with someone. So I did. And a little later, I had what they call a contact meeting. Someone from this organization said they would meet with me. We set up a meeting. Young guy who was Pat, I'll give his name. Pat, he was a FedEx or UPS driver, kind of forget, he was a driver. And he was been with the organization for a long time. We met this outdoor coffee shop or something, Harvard Square. It was really fun. We hung out for a little bit. He had a copy of the newspaper. Socialist Alternative newspaper. It was then called Justice. And I read through it. It was that was the time the water war was going on in Bolivia. Basically, they had IMF loans, and IMF was really pounding them into had privatized the water supply. In fact, it was against the law to collect rainwater from your roof. And this created huge mass protests and riots called water wars. And eventually Evo Morales and the MAS, movement for socialism, came out of this. So it was starting around that time, and I met with her. We talked about it. Initially, I was really impressed that he knew a lot about Latin American politics. I kind of was aware of this, but didn't really, wasn't following it all that closely at the time. So it was interesting. So the next thing we set up a second meeting, and he gave me a copy of the paper, said, read the paper and we can talk about it. Okay. So like, I don't know, a week later, we met a second time. The second meeting didn't really go as well. Admittedly, I didn't read the paper, but there were other things I could have talked about. And Pat seemed kind of distracted, like, I don't know, he sort of distracted, but it didn't seem like he was really into it. Then the meeting kind of petered out. I said, I want to join. What's the next step? I would like to join. So he said something like vaguely, well, the next step would be to check out one of our public meetings. So I did. So I don't know, a couple of weeks later, they had a public meeting at Harvard. It was in a classroom. And I don't remember it was small, it was a few people, small number of people were there. I think it was, I don't remember when it was during the day. I went there and I was reading, interestingly at the time, Trotskyist History of the Russian Revolution, which if you've ever read, it's an amazing book. Even people who don't like Trotsky love that book. I know people hate Trotsky. You actually love that book. It's very well written. It's very, and it changed your whole perspective of the Russian Revolution. If you're a traditional American, oh, horrible, and it's horrible. It gives you a whole different perspective of what's happening. So anyway, I took it out from the library. I took it with me. I went to this public meeting. It was interesting. I chatted with one guy who said to me, wow, that book is really cool. I don't think he was a socialist alternative member, a sympathizer or something, but anyway, it's kind of, so I signed like the book, this contact sheet if you want to, more information, contact me, and no one ever got back to me. So a couple months later, there was another big public meeting. This one was big, but really big. It was a night. It was in downtown Boston at this place called the Community Church. They're kind of like a left-wing church group. Like I've been there a couple of times, like anarchists, the Raging Grannies protest groups sing, and they were kind of interesting. I went there a few times, and there are a lot of activist events there. The Transgender Day of Remembrance event was held there, a bunch of stuff. So I went there. So it's the community church, and this woman, Claire Doyle, who was a member of the Socialist Alternative International. They had the CWI, the Committee for Workers International. They had branches in, I don't know, 15 different countries or something. I've not made them. It was really interesting. So she gave this talk. She had organized a garbage strike in Dublin. And she explained how it did a little trouble understanding her. She had a thick Irish brogue, and she said she had trouble understanding what Americans said, but I could get through it. And it was packed. Actually, the meeting was packed. And some people were on some interesting points of discussion. Was really interesting. At the end, I left. I again signed the contact sheet. If you weren't interested, I signed it. And so I went to get some Thai food. This cheap Thai restaurant, which I really like nearby. I had some Thai food, and I walked back and I passed this bar, and I was outdoor bar nearby. So there's a strip nearby. I think it was on Boylston Street in Boston, if I remember. And there was this outdoor bar place, and socialist alternative people were sitting, having a few drinks and hanging out. And I kind of almost should have walked up and introduced myself, but I don't know if it would be cool. I don't know if it would have been cool, but I felt bad. Like I kind of got the impression after that they didn't want me. That, maybe they thought I was a Fed, they thought I was a narc, or maybe because I'm trans. For some reason they didn't want me. And I felt bad, but I was kind of puzzled by this. They didn't want me. They realized, so, okay, time passed. A little complicated story about a friend who I used to hang out with named Abby. Met her through like a long story, very LGBT stuff. She was a young woman who was struggling with transgender stuff. She had recently broken up with her boyfriend, and we would hang out together. And it turns out she was a socialist. She was in a group called the ISO, called the International Socialist Organization. They're another group. They're kind of a rival group to Socialist Alternative. They had a fairly sizable branch in Boston as well. So one day she said, they were putting on this chartering these buses to go to a demonstration in DC. I've been to a whole bunch of demos in DC. I've been there a lot, but they were chartering this bus. We were supposed to meet if I wanted to go meet at night. It was like $40 to go down. We meet at this train station JP subway stop, Jamaica Plain. And oh, and I got a whole bunch of people who were not in the ISO, but were, anti-war, peace activists, whatever, just wanted to go down. And I don't know what happened. They were screwed up. It fell through. They were ISO had really screwed it up, and the bus never materialized. People were kind of disappointed or drifted off. But some of the ISO people, what they did is they rented at short notice 2 vans. I don't know how they did this at night, short notice, but they rented 2 vans and put in some money and stuff. Okay, so we went down to DC. And I don't remember, it was like an overnighter. I think it's like 7 or 8 hours from Boston to DC and then went back again. I actually don't remember a lot of it. It was like really grueling. I got no sleep, but so it's okay. And we marched in DC. My friend Abby was a little pissed off. It was kind of really disorganized. We probably did much more walking than she was a little cranky, a little annoyed. We were going to go to this place in DC called the I think they closed, the Poets and Busboys Cafe, something like that. It was kind of famous in leftist circles, supposedly a worker-owned coffee shop or place where they have like poetry readings and stuff. And the Poets and Busboys Cafe, I believe it's called. It was started by someone who had been in the ISO, a couple who had been in the ISO years ago. When I left, we were going to go there. But one time we met up with some ISO members from New York City, but I don't know. It was anyway. At one point one leader, Brian Katoba, asked me if I wanted to join. Yeah, I agreed. Okay, I'll join. And my friend Abby was kind of a little shocked by that, a little surprised. She was in it, but I think she was getting all disillusioned by it. But yeah, sure, I'll join. So we went back to Boston. I don't remember much of it. I was like, sleep deprivation, whole thing, but that's okay. Anyway, about a week later, back in Boston, I met with Brian Katoba. He was a young guy. He was doing his student teaching at a local school there. Really interesting guy. Sounded like a really African-American guy, really cool guy, very knowledgeable. So we talked for a while. And I remember I asked him, we had this contact meeting, and I asked him, like, are you guys Trotskyist? He said, yeah, we're Trotskyist heretics. And he explained to me their theory that the most Trotskyists believe the Soviet Union was a degenerate worker state. We believe it's like state capitalism. There's some military competition. The Soviet Union became capitalist as well. So they were both, the Cold War were 2 rival capitalists. And, okay, I didn't really, okay, sure, okay, it's interesting. I wasn't 100% sure I agreed with him, but I didn't know enough to really go over the nuts and bolts of it there. Oh, and then later on, because I learned a lot more about it. So he gave me some literature. I agreed to join and gave me some literature to read. And I was kind of excited but nervous, like I'm joining a communist group. And I read through the literature. It's kind of similar to the way I thought, a little different, but very, very similar. And I thought about it. And then I joined. I got involved with them. I was in it for like 3 months, really, or a little less than 3 months. So first, they have like a paper set. They have weekly meetings. I think by then they were in Roxbury, a suburb of Boston, a little ways out, and at a community college in Roxbury. And the meetings were fascinating, really very interesting. And people talk about geohistory or geopolitics, and really interesting, compelling. And we meet afterwards and have a few beers or hang out at a bar nearby afterwards. And really thought, wow, cool. I can hang out with real life communists. This is really cool. It's kind of cool. But there were some things starting to get a little odd as I was in it. It's hard to put this into words and really complicated. But after a couple of meetings, I got in the get-togethers afterwards. I picked up I can't explain, odd interpersonal, like I was kind of metaphorically at the little kids table. Like I wasn't entirely taken seriously. I could pick up who the movers and shakers of the organization were. There was definitely a subtle pecking order. I could subtle. Maybe I was a really new member and I didn't know like their history and theory at the time. Okay, yeah, I get that. There was some subtle who was really running things. I could kind of pick up. It's hard to explain, and maybe I'm reading too much into it. My first couple of meetings, my friend Abby would go there and we'd hang out. It was kind of fun. She dropped out after about 2 weeks. She stopped. I'm sorry, I'd stay in it myself. Okay, so they had a really. I heard found this later, they work their members, especially their new members, really hard. Like there's a mandatory 2-hour meeting. there are two mandatory paper sales. Like a lot of what the socialist group do is sell newspapers or sell literature. They do tabling. They have a table and they stand out and they sell the literature. Partly to raise money for the organization, mostly. Well, partly to get the word out. And it's part of the Leninist theory of party building. Like it's supposed to be the party is built around a paper, putting out these newspapers, or is a collaborative efforts of party building. I think, YouTube videos now get many more views. A couple hundred people read these socialist papers, while tens of thousands of people watch it. What's left is YouTube. But okay, anyway, be that as it may, we sell the papers and literature. There was also two mandatory. Each one was 2 hours long, and then we meet with we have a fraction. We have a fraction. You'd have your fraction group. I joined the anti-war fraction, called fraction. Okay, they don't really, it's supposed to be mandatory. They didn't really enforce it. I guess they didn't actually enforce it, but it did seem like a lot. Some things, okay, yeah, let me think. Okay, yeah, there was this meeting that there is a suburb of Boston called Jamaica Plain, JP. It seemed to be their hangout. They did a lot. I don't know if any of them lived in JP, even they might have, but it was like their hangout, their area. They were in this group, this Justice, Anti-War, Freedom and Justice Coalition, whatever, in JP. They were a member of it. And one time we had this film that they put on a film. They had public meetings, put on a film where they showed in a discussion, Yes Sir, No Sir, anti-war movie. It's about the GI resistance during the Vietnam War. Great film, by the way. Great film. One of the reasons the U.S. got out of Vietnam because the military, not the only reason, but the U.S. military mutiny. They killed their officers, literally. And this describes some of this. And really intriguing movie. So there was some buzz going on. I remember in the Boston left at that time, like why there isn't a bigger student anti-war movement. Like the Vietnam War era, there was a huge student movement. Why we don't have that now? And no, I thought, the obvious reason is we don't have a draft, obviously. But that wasn't the ISO's line. ISO said that we don't, students aren't organizing an anti-war movement because they don't think it'll work. They don't think it'll go anywhere. We have to convince them that it'll work. And that was their party line. So anyway, we saw this movie. We showed this movie there. I brought a friend who was kind of a libertarian, not really political, mildly like libertarian kind of. We just wanted as a friend. She liked the movie. And I think they were a little annoyed that I brought someone unannounced. I don't know, they didn't like that. So who is that person? I was like, who is she? And okay, so also I brought up, why there isn't an anti-student, anti-war movement. I brought up the fact that, the obvious fact that there isn't a draft. Well, that wasn't their party line. Someone afterwards, the ISO was there. There was a small group. Some other non-ISO people were there. It was mixed, but a little while later, when one leader took me aside and scolded me a little. No, wait, we've decided it's not because of that. Got really upset, a little upset at me. That wasn't their party line. Okay. There's more stuff going on that I learned about later on. Okay. Anyway, the big thing is after a couple of weeks, there was this anti-war activist, Cindy Sheehan, who's still on, she's on my Facebook list, really interesting person. Cindy Sheehan, her son Casey was killed in the Iraq War. And Cindy was kind of a left-wing Catholic of some sort, and her son was killed. She organized this protest movement. She camped outside Bush's ranch in Crawford, Camp Casey, they called it. She got a lot of buzz in the media for a time. Then she ran up against the vote from the Democratic Party. That's when, she was totally canceled, Anyway, she was going to be speaking in Boston. She was speaking in Boston, JP, at this place called Spontaneous Celebrations. It's like this place where they had meetings and concerts and plays and stuff, events. And she was going to be speaking at Spontaneous Celebrations one night. I was going to go there with my fraction leader, a young woman named Julie. She was short, had blonde dreadlocks, and really very, very smart, really intelligent person. So we were going to go there. And that day, I had a really bad time at work, really complicated. This manager named Rudy had been giving me a really hard time. He gave everyone a hard time. I just yelled back when the managers did this. He was a little fucking prick. I said to him one day, he scolded me for being too long in the bathroom. I said to him something like, I won't say anything about the child abuse scandals. I didn't have any. He worked at a group home. I know he managed a group home. He had a second job. I probably shouldn't have said that. I didn't have any evidence of child abuse he was involved in. But there's the only thing I can think of. He hit the roof. He called for a meeting, a couple of the managers, and he was really angry. He said, be very careful what you say right now. Your future with the company depends on it. I said, you're going to fire me no matter what. I said, just go fuck yourself. And I said, a union rep was there. I said, just go fuck yourself. And I just walked out. And I was certain I was going to be fired. So I said, I called up Julie, the fraction leader. Fraction leader told I've had a really bad time at work. I'm got to cancel out. I'm really sorry. But okay. She said, yeah, okay. So I got home. I thought about that. I said, why don't I go to see Cindy Sheehan? It's more interesting. Why don't, if I'm fired, I'm fired. Turns out I wasn't fired. I was suspended. I was suspended for the weekend. Like, so what? And later on, the top manager was actually sympathetic to me. As I said, there's an incredible amount of weird office politics at that place. So I called back Julie. Said, yeah, tell you what, I'd like to go anyway. Why not? I'm going to go anyway. So she said to me, no, we've decided, like the party has decided you should stay home and read. There's this book, The Meaning of Marxism by Paul D'Amato. The ISO kind of used that as a training manual. So we've decided it's better for you to sit home, stay at home and read. We're not going to do it like we've canceled out. We're not going to do this. Why don't you just go home and read? I forget how she put it, but we're not going to do this. We're not going to see Cindy. Just stay home and read The Meaning of Marxism. No, I did. Okay, I did. Okay, so I don't know, about a week later or whenever, I saw her at this, they had this demonstration in Boston Common, anti-war demo. And one thing about the ISO, they had to plan out everything. One thing about the ISO, they had to meticulously plan anything before they went to a demonstration or anything. They'd plan it out. They'd have a briefing. Then afterwards, they have a debriefing. It took all the fun out of stuff. It was very meticulously planned. It took a lot of fun out of everything. But anyway, we had this meeting before the demonstration, and someone asked Julia, "How was Cindy Sheehan?" Oh, and she was gushing about, "Oh, it was wonderful. Oh, she was so inspiring." I was pissed off, like she had lied to me. She told me they weren't going. She wasn't going. She went. She had lied to me. And I didn't say anything, but I was a little miffed. I didn't really say anything, but I didn't know what to say. But I felt a little odd about that. Okay, so the big thing came towards the end. What happened is, they worked people really hard. There was about a week. I had a mild cold. I didn't do anything for a week. I skipped the meeting and I just told them I have a cold. I forget what I said, but my friend Abby had left the ISO. She I'd seen her in a few weeks. She called me and said, "Do you want to go to do an immigrant rights rally?" I said, "Yeah, okay." Apparently, this was during the late Bush administration. They had ICE raids. Trump was doing it. People were outraged. Bush was kind of doing the same thing. They were arresting undocumented immigrants who had been in the community for years or decades even. And people were really outraged. So there was a protest at the ICE detention facility in Rhode Island. I think it was New Bedford. I forget the name of the town, the place in Rhode Island. So I don't remember how I got there, but I met with Abby. It turns out she was now with Socialist Alternative, the other group, and there were two other Socialist Alternative comrades there, Dennis and Pam, really interesting people, and they were selling the newspaper. Their paper was Justice. They were selling paper to have a stack of papers, and I joined in, trying to sell it to people or whatever, and it was like $1 each, and okay. So interestingly, there were a lot of ISO people there. I mean, a lot. The Boston branch, and they apparently brought a lot of people they had a Rhode Island branch and a New York City branch, a huge number of ISO people there. They're outside. They weren't really inside. They were sitting outside. And it was a little awkward. I passed by and then, "Hey, Kate, hi." It was like a little awkward, but I said to Abby, I feel a little awkward. She said, "Don't worry about it. You're working for socialism. It's kind of the same thing. We're doing the same thing." Okay. So I walked around and I saw some ISO people. No one had told me they were going to be there. Admittedly, I skipped the meeting, but no one had told me at all they were going to be there. And it was a little weird. So my fraction leader, Julie, was there. And she, I know she wanted to take me aside. Can I talk to you for a minute? Yeah, okay, sure. Yes, usually. When someone says, "Can I talk to you for a minute?" that's usually when they're going to scold you, but okay, when you're in trouble. So she said, she really was upset. Not the fact that I was doing something with another socialist group, with Socialist Alternative. I was in the ISO. Not that I was doing something with another socialist organization, but the fact she scolded me for the fact that I had been there at all. I was not ordered there by the party. Like I was supposed to stay there and stay at home and read the meaning of Marxism or whatever stuff they had me read at the time. She scolded me for being there at all. So okay, yeah, sure. And then okay, and then I remember, okay, it was a little odd, but okay. Okay, I'm really sorry, but okay. Then anyway, went back a while later. Went back with the two Abby and two socialist alternative comrades, and I kind of thought the intellectual level was a lot higher than ISO. Frankly, one guy, what was Pam, was from Chile. Her parents had been in the Chilean Communist Party, and she had become a Trotskyist. Really interesting talking to her. And Dennis was like a semi-grad student. We're both really interesting. I thought the talk was more on a higher intellectual level. We talked on the way back, and kind of interesting. So then the next ISO meeting I had gone to, and Julie, she wanted to schedule a meeting with me to talk about Lenin's theory of party discipline. There's, tell me why I was a bad girl and had a, party discipline, where I party, and okay, then, yeah, okay, sure, you can give me a call. And then backtrack a little bit, I was seeing a therapist, and I kind of told her, she wasn't a socialist, but she was, kind of sympathetic. And I told her about the ISO. She once said to me, how, they work people really, really hard to two mandatory paper sales, a meeting, blah, mandatory meetings, sounds like, she said, one time they sound like a cult. And I had to be kind of do. And so I had to make a decision which group to, I talked to my friend Abby. I told her the situation when I met with this guy, Pat, and he had never gone back to me. And I assumed they, thought because I'm trans or maybe I'm a security risk, I was a Fed or something, they didn't want me. And so she said she talked to the branch organizer, a guy named Brian. She talked to the branch organizer about my situation. And then she came back and said, Brian, yeah, sure, you'd be more than welcome. It's not, the fact you're trans is not a problem at all. You'd be more than welcome. And so I talked this over with my therapist. I was saying, I said, I'm going to have to make a decision. If I want to be in a socialist group, I'm going to have to make a decision. And I did. I joined Socialist Alternative. Julie kept calling and calling. I just didn't answer her calls. I didn't formally resign. I just, dropped out, didn't answer the calls. Interestingly, I was in the ISO for 3 months. I never paid fee membership dues. They kept asking me to do a direct deposit. I kind of put it off, and I think they assumed I was already doing it or something. I never actually paid any dues. It would have been really difficult to get off it if I had resigned. So anyway, so I left the ISO and I joined Socialist Alternative. Okay, so long story. I was in it for over 10 years. A little bit more about the ISO briefly. They actually had collapsed. They eventually collapsed in 2019. They had, I learned a lot of weird stuff about them. First, they're splitists. There's ISO, an International Socialist Organization's US group, and their origins are kind of complicated. They had affiliated with another group in Britain called the Socialist Workers' Party, the UK SWP. And the SWP in the UK was like the mothership, the parent organization. These two groups had like different origins, but they came together, and they look up to the SWP as the parent organization, and it was led by a guy named Tony Cliff. And eventually they had split, actually, but it was led by a guy named Tony Cliff, and he had a theory. Part of he talked about this splitting. Like what they do is their methodology was to join a group, like a coalition, anti-war coalition, some kind of activist coalition, and destroy it, like force a split. Force their super sector, and they force a split, and hopefully the more radical group will join them. And it's a stated methodology. Like the British SWP has a very bad reputation. They hijack demos, they destroy coalitions they're involved in, on and on. So the ISO on a much smaller level was kind of doing the same thing. Like I found out later this anti-war freedom and peace, whatever it's called, in Jamaica Plain. The ISO was trying to do that with this group, which is why they scolded me for being off topic. They kind of wasn't, I was being not off topic, off message, wasn't the message they were trying. I was only in for like a short time, the ISO relatively short time. I picked up a lot of odd interpersonal dynamics, but I didn't really know like the thick of it. Okay, they're splitist, and the rest of the left, most of the left didn't really like the ISO. They had a bad reputation. A lot of people hated them. Anarchists especially really hated them. They're supposed to be like socialism from the bottom up. So, but they were the exact opposite, very top down, very hierarchical. Some drama on 2010. There was what people call the whitening. Some people have called the whitening of the ISO. Really, really complicated. Yeah, years after I left, but the whitening of the ISO was Okay, the ISO had internally been having a long debate on identity politics, the role of identity politics. And people of color in the ISO felt their concerns weren't listened to. They were probably right, although I don't know all the details. They felt their concerns weren't listened to, and there was a lot of internal debate, and people were really upset. So there was this guy named, going into it. Now, the socialist groups have rule, or Trotskyist groups have rules governing factions. Like these parties are Leninist. Leninist parties, there's party discipline, there's the idea of democratic centralism. You can have a lot of internal debate, but once something's decided on, that's what you do. And you can't criticize the party from outside. You can't publicly criticize it. The organizations have a mechanism for a faction, like a group of people really disagree with something, you can form a faction. There are specific rules governing how you form a faction. Sometimes if things get really heated, a faction will just leave and form a separate organization. And this is in the Trotskyist movement. This has happened many, many times. I'm talking very thirsty and my voice is talking very rapidly. I'm getting thirsty here. But okay, so anyway, they have rules governing how it varies from organization to organization, but rules governing how you can form a faction. So in a nutshell, in the ISO, it's something like part of the year you could have a faction, part of the year you couldn't. There was like a conference period. I don't remember when this was, when you can have a faction before the conference, but after everything's decided on, you can't have a faction. So anyway, there was a guy named Ahmed Shawki who was like kind of nominal leader. He was an Egyptian. He was brought over by the British SWP, kind of put in charge. He apparently was publicly drunk a couple times, and I don't know really what his role was by then. He was kind of a nominal figurehead character. But 2010, what happened is he had this kangaroo court of ISO top leaders who went around the country, and these local ISO branches were demanded to see some of these people of color who were upset and summarily expelled them. The grounds they used that these people were, they didn't form a faction, but there was a loose network. They were sending emails to each other saying how upset they were about what the party was doing. They sent emails. And these people, and they used as grounds for accusing them of illegally forming a faction. And they were expelled right on the spot. And many, I don't know, dozens of people were expelled, a large part of that membership. And I read about how this happened. It was awful. Now, I think these people always had really bad politics. I disagree with them, but the way they were treated by their own organization was just horrible. Some of these people had been, there was a career. Some people were professional organizers. Not all of them were. Some of them were just really dedicated to the party, spent years trying to build it up. What they thought was building socialism, building a revolutionary socialist group, and their own organization turned on them. And I read accounts of how this was done. It was really devastating to these people. Really horrible way to treat people, even though I disagree with their politics. Horrible way to treat people. So I'm kind of glad I left. I caught a small glimpse of that. And long story, they around the same time they expelled or destroyed their Rhode Island branch. There's a whole complicated drama. The way I read, they're so manipulative and bureaucratic and supposed to be socialism from below, but they're really exact opposite. Okay, anyway, then they collapsed in 2019. What happened is, it's complicated, but one of their members, I think of Facebook or someone else, kind of spilled the beans and wrote something publicly about a lot of the abusive practices of the leadership. I mean, really abusive. And other people started, the floodgates were broken and people were breaking party discipline. Many people, Facebook, social media, publicly, wherever, were openly talking about how abusive the leadership was, sometimes physically abusive, beat up people who disagree with them. There was sexual abuse, rapes, there are all kinds of horrific stuff, and on, horrifically emotionally destructive, emotionally abusive. And they had a couple big online meetings. And when this first started, the leadership resigned or was pushed out. Some academic people who were connected to the ISO, including Paul D'Amato, and there's Kienga Taylor, I forget her name exactly. I have one of her books. I can't quite get her name straight, but I have one of her books. She left. The ISO did have a fair number of academic people connected with, and they left pretty early on. They didn't want their brand to be tarnished as like public intellectuals or whatever. They didn't want their brand. So they didn't want to be involved. I mean, if you really believe in something, you'd fight for it, but they just left. Any sign of anything, they just left pretty quickly. They didn't want their brand to be tarnished. But so this debates went on, really, really intense stuff went on for a few months. They had a couple of big meetings. The leadership was expelled. Some of these people have been leaders since the late 1970s when the ISO was founded. They were pushed out or left. They had several attempts to reform the ISO. And they had they had a final meeting where they got, oh, we're going to have a looser knit. We're going to keep the organization, but totally change the way we do things. And it turned out the organizer of this new reform effort himself was outed as a rapist. So that was it for the ISO one meeting. They voted to, the membership voted to disband. Some people, and there was no more ISO. This was sent shockwaves to the rest of the left. The ISO was gone. Really, it's possible, some theories that the vote to dissolve itself was all itself set up. It didn't have to be that way. There were other alternatives, but okay. So then postscript, they have a publishing house, Haymarket, which puts out some good stuff. They still exist. They were actually run by a corporation. And some people claim, the ISO itself was essentially the unpaid sales force of Haymarket. We sell their paper. The paper was Socialist work. It was actually pretty good, but we were like ISO was like the unpaid sales force of Haymarket, essentially. No one quite knew what their relationship was. It was a left-wing publishing house, but what their connection was, nobody quite knew. Kind of interestingly, they had this ISO would every year put on an annual socialism conference in Chicago. Well, they put the very last one, that's probably ended now, but the very last one was in 2018 or 2019, 2018. After the ISO had dissolved, they put on one more conference. It was put on by the DSA, had taken over in Haymarket. It still exists. They put on this thing in Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton of the Gray Zone. They went to it. They did a critique of it. And I largely agree. It could have been a little more nuanced, but their critique said, these groups, organizations, nonprofits were at the Socialism Conference, and they get funding from your Security State Cutouts Endowment for Democracy, Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, etc. Because the ISO, big thing, they're a third campus organization. They where Cuba is social. Cuba's state capitalist. Soviet Union was state capitalist. Third campus, U.S. imperialism is bad, but the other guys are bad too. Syria is bad. ISO was really super anti-Assad. Syria is bad. Syria, Assad is bad. Baathists are bad. They're bad. They're all, and they kind of, I don't like Assad. Of course, all kinds. But I happen to think my previous videos, U.S. imperialism is the absolute worst. It's not. You can't say U.S. imperialism is bad, but what about Russia? They're saying people who are really big on free Ukraine right now. My politics are different. I'm anti-imperialist. There was third campus anti-imperialist, and I talked about this in the previous video. So the ISO was very much a third campus group, which seemed to kind of dovetail with the U.S. security state. And, the Haymarket and those groups got some tacit funding. I think the vast majority of ISO people were really well-meaning, dedicated revolutionaries, but, they were mostly constructive opposition, to be really blunt about it. Okay, so anyway, ISO, a lot of people, ISO collapsed. A lot of people joined the DSA. Many people just dropped out of politics. Some people joined the DSA. There was a very large ISO branch where I live, and I went to it. Long story, they hijacked Comrade when I was in Socialist Alternative, a small branch, a socialist club at USM, University of Southern Maine. ISO people came and made into an ISO branch. They hijacked. I was a little pissed off at them about that, but I admit I wasn't the world's greatest organizer at times. So anyway, they built up a very large ISO branch, and they effectively joined the DSA. They had this big protest from Senator Susan Collins, and kind of moderately liberal. She was saying she might vote for Kavanaugh, and there were sit-ins in her office and huge protests. And they had a couple big meetings. I went to some of these meetings. I don't know, I wasn't involved in anything. I was looking for something to be involved in. I went to a couple of these meetings, and people they're kind of liberal circle jerks. The socialist view, the communist view of that whole thing was that the Supreme Court is not a legitimate institution anyway. You don't beg politicians not to vote for Kavanaugh or whatever. The Supreme Court itself is not a legitimate institution. One of these meetings, a young woman, I think she was in the DSA, she stood up and she started crying. because Trump was president. No, Trump's president. He's under investigation, and he's appointing someone. Well, he's appointing a Supreme Court justice. Well, she's under investigation. This has never happened before in American history. It was just like that. And I was like, no one ever, somebody should talk to her, but no, there was like a liberal circle, could be one. So the the Portland, Maine branch of the ISO kind of joined the DSA. They basically did the same thing anyway. And other groups of the former ISO formed what's called the Revolutionary Socialist Network. Like I interviewed James Rodden, Denver, Colorado, former ISO are in this group. And there's a group in Ohio, a few other groups. They've formed this Revolutionary Socialist Network, which, they might do some good stuff. They, in turn, merged with a group called Socialist Resurgence. And I was invited to join them. I don't agree with their foreign policies. They merged as Revolutionary Socialist Network. One thing about the Trotskyist movement, there's zillions of splits and factions and stuff. Okay. I could go on and on about the British SWP, but they have a horrible they had a horrible reputation themselves. They would destroy coalitions they were part of, sabotage. Around 2014, they had a meltdown, the Comrade Delta affair, where one of the top organizers was outed as a rapist. He raped 2 women, and they went out of their way to protect him, and there was huge drama. The British SWP, they actually lost the entire student section. They lost most of the branches, and it was just insane. There's a guy named Richard Seymour, who was a blogger. He had this famous blog called Lenin's Tomb, which was very famous in the ISO. When I was in the ISO, everybody loved this. So Richard Seymour, he was kind of nominally in the SWP. I don't think he attended meetings or anything. He wasn't a leader. He ended up as part of the opposition, and he left after he split at a group which split from the SWP. I don't remember what it was called. He, in turn, there was a split in Richard Seymour's group over S&M sex. Seriously, something called race play. Like he had an African British girlfriend. They would play pretend to be like a white slave master and a black slave, and doing in privacy in their own home. It's not good taste, but that's what they did. He talked about this on Facebook, and he was expelled from the group that he had started. Actually, in I think the Guardian or some paper said it was the weirdest Trotskyist split ever. They're a split over S&M sex. Weird. So anyway. Okay, that's the ISO, that tradition. I'm glad they collapsed. They were very destructive role on the left. And there's, okay, anyway, another group. I was in Socialist Alternative for something over 10 years. And initially, I felt they were a far healthier group than the ISO. Boston branch was kind of more macho. The ISO branch, Boston branch, was very queer, very LGBT. Half the members were gay or trans or something. The Socialist Alternative branch was kind of more macho. They were really interesting people, and they were really cool people. I learned a lot. I had a couple study groups who were really good. And I had a couple of massive reading binges on my own. I stayed up till, what the good thing about the call center job, I worked the second, third shift. I didn't have to get up early in the morning, so I'd stay up till 2 or 3 in the morning reading like the Marxist stuff on the Marxist Internet Archive online. I'd read Trotsky and Lenin, tons and tons of stuff. There's this guy, I'm not a left communist. There's a guy named Lauren Goldner, who has this left communist group. He has a website called Break Their Haughty Chains. Left communists are a different tradition. They're like ultra left. And I had an email exchange with Lauren Goldner, and he recommended a bunch of stuff for me to read. And I read about 2/3 of it. So I read like the Marxist classics. I read Mazaros and Lukács, and I went tons and tons of stuff, and I got up to speed on theory and the history of the socialist movement and things like that. Okay. Long story. So I was half the time I was in Socialist Alternative. I was very active in the Boston branch, did a lot with them. But to Minneapolis, one good thing about Socialist group, you get to travel a lot. I went to Minneapolis a couple of times for their meetings, national meetings, NC, whatever, national conference. Then I went to Seattle. I was about a month and a half in Seattle. And, I've traveled around the world, but I haven't seen that much of the U.S. and stuck in a small town New England for years. So it was really interesting. I would love, because I was a big fan of Gashama Sawant. She actually won an election to Seattle City Council. Can't forget the year, but wow, great, that's cool. Other people on the left started saying, she's kind of lowballing it. She's demands are pretty moderate. She did get the moderate minimum wage raised, but even that compromised. And she was lowballing it because she calling for like workers' control of industry, things that could have been much more radical in her demands. And yeah, I defended her, but I could kind of see that. Then there were a bunch of things happened. There were some stories that she was more closer to local Democratic Party politicians in Seattle. When she actually, one point, she actually voted for a chief of police. Now, a socialist should not do that. Should vote against anyone running for chief of police. Doesn't matter who they were. You don't do that. Chief of police is part of state security. And Seattle police killed people. They know a whole bunch of people. They killed police across the country. So that's on her. She should have voted against anyone for chief of police. Anyway, I didn't hate her, but gradually, hearing things. There were in 2016, Socialist Alternative voted for Bernie Sanders, or no, endorsed Bernie Sanders, called the Burn Turn. It was considered to be a huge shift in direction. Like when I was in it, you were drummed into the Democratic Party as the enemy. You do not support Democrats as a politics of lesser evilism. The purpose of running any campaign is to raise class consciousness. The Leninist idea of party of this, you build class consciousness. The working class and the ruling class are inherently enemies. You don't run people in the Democratic Party. But there was a lot of waffling about Bernie Sanders. The organization kind of officially didn't endorse him, but did at the same time. They were giving a lot of mixed messages. Even members were really confused. A fair number of members said, no, we don't endorse Sanders. But other members of leadership said, yeah, we did. They kind of did and they didn't. And if Bernie Sanders had run as an independent, there might have been more of a case to build a separate organization. But anyway, so that was a mess. They had, the leadership of Socialist Alternative had decided on this course without telling anyone. Then they had a series of debates, internal debates, after the decision had been made. And I went to one of them in Boston, got kind of heated, but it was kind of interesting. There was definitely fissures in the organization developing. There were a whole bunch of things happening. So, I think history, like recent history, AOC and Sanders, their trajectory shown I was right. They're frauds. It's pretty much understood by everybody. They were frauds. Interesting that people had joined Socialist Alternative like way long after I did, shot their way to the top, became the top leadership. I'd been in and working with it, but I never got close to leadership. I felt a little odd about that, but no big deal. One member who joined long after I did, but was a leading comrade. She posted on Facebook, there was some event like Bernie was talking to Elizabeth Warren. And there's a photo of them, and she posted, it's really good that people on the left are talking to each other. She got a lot of shit for that. She later on deleted it or changed it, but I still have a screenshot of it. Anyway, so there were huge debates over the Burn Turn. It's not, Socialist Alternative originally advocated like what they call the bold approach, bold intervention with the Sanders campaign. Is not supporting Sanders, but very aggressively talking to people who do. And I would agree with that. But they went a few steps further and actually voted for him, supported him in the campaign. But there were a couple of Socialist Alternative members in the Democratic National Committee. As delegates, the convention. And we didn't know this. It kind of came out a bit later. One point they supposedly led a walkout, like after they voted, DNC, whatever, the committee voted against Sanders, they led a walkout. However, they walked back in a little bit later, and my dog here, they walked back in, and the whole walkout thing nobody knew about. There's a media blackout. This whole thing is kind of nonsense anyway. Okay, so after there was a big fight during and after it. Branches left, partly Sanders, partly some other things. After Kashama got in, the organization had some explosive growth. Like we were hoping for like maybe 1,000 members and maybe build up into a literal mass revolutionary organization. That of course didn't happen. There were creeping opportunism. Really, really complicated what happened. There were some huge fights. Branches left. We had a Socialist Alternative, a large Austin, Texas branch, and they had a satellite branch. They turned out to be largely Maoist. They actually left. We had a large Mobile, Alabama branch who recruited after Occupy, and they left partly because of the burn turn support for Sanders, but also because of bureaucratic micromanagement. They got pissed off, just left. And they joined the Green Party and then dissolved. There were some other groups like that. The Rhode Island branch left. And then finally, I have some, hold on. Okay, yeah, there was a lot of drama. The Austin, Texas branch left, Mobile branch left, Providence, Rhode Island branch left, opposite the burn turn. There was a lot of, I was part of the opposition. There was left opposition. There was talk of forming a faction, but the fact that the opposition itself was in so many different directions, it was impossible. Really, we didn't have a coherent political angle. Political opposition. There's so many different groups, and everyone was going off on their own. People just eventually left. I stayed in it. I actually left in 2018. I was like a non-at-large member for a large part of the time. They had New England regional meetings, which I really enjoyed. I really went in Boston. They were like once a month, and that was my main contact with the organization. They ended the regional meetings mainly because one individual who had been a former Spartacus League member in high school, and they regard him as kind of ultra left. They didn't want his influence to be, contaminated, to permeate other people. And I have a feeling they kind of ended it largely because of that. Could be wrong, but anyway, they ended. That was like my only contact with the organization. No one really went out to me. One person kind of did, who was actually also in the opposition. Nobody really went out to me. And then 20 people I've been close to had left. There was this drama. One of the founding members in New York branch was expelled. She was founding member. She was very strongly against the burn turn, and she saw as the opportunism, and she was expelled and unjustly. She didn't really get a hearing. There's a big fight over that. And so anyway, people started leaving one by one. Stuff came, when I backtrack a bit, a few years earlier, there was this, also, I think it was in 2014, 2015, I made 2014, I don't remember. Also, the organization had these, I was an at-large member. I'd go to the New Hampshire branch meetings. It was the closest one. There wasn't even really an official branch, but a bunch of us in New Hampshire was the closest. And they had these new guidelines, grievance procedure for sexual harassment. And okay, it was a good idea, but it came from out of the blue. Like, what's going on? Why did I have this? Totally came from out of the blue. Then after I left Socialist, I found out some weird shit going on. Apparently, I mentioned the guy who had interviewed me and Pat, who never got back to me, and he was notorious for cherry picking members. He'd let people in, let people join who either politically agreed with him, and he was on the far right wing of the organization, by the way, who'd politically agree with him or were hot babes. And he didn't see me as either one, I guess. They really want me in. He'd cherry pick members. He was famous for this. And I found out later there's some talk of what they call sports fishing in the Seattle branch. Not everyone, vast majority of people are really cool, but there are a bunch of guys who would, trade women back and forth. New women would join and they'd trade women. And one woman, comrade, was outraged by this, and then word got out. There was a whole internal ruckus in the organization. I didn't know any of this until a while after I left. A whole bunch of stuff going on that I didn't know about. That's the tip of the iceberg, so much other stuff. Now, I got to emphasize the vast majority of people are extremely nice and really well-meaning comrades. I thought the organization had this weird, anyway, there was this one member from New Jersey, young girl, who read all 3 volumes of Marx's Capital, or Das Kapital, in high school. And the Grundrisse, like, whoa, she was in high school. And she joined it, and she was like shot up to the leadership. We really liked it. She was really young. She shot up to the top. Everyone liked her. Everyone was impressed. Then apparently they did a number on her. She abruptly dropped out. She actually joined the DSA. And then apparently she went back to the Catholic Church or something. They psychologically did a number on her. I don't want to say, I'd be really careful what I say, but anyway, I keep this on a political level, not. So, upshot, I left in 2018. I was an at-large member, still paying dues. For a time, I was paying like $100 a month dues. Like, I felt bad. I couldn't be more active. So then I couldn't keep doing that. I reduced it. But I finally left in 2018. And there were people in New Hampshire, 2 comrades I was close to. and we were on the left wing of it. They were building like a separate organization. I said, yeah, I would have loved to do stuff with them. I did stuff with them. I mean, it's a 2.5 hour or 2.5 hour drive from where I live, but I do a lot of stuff with them. And they left before I did. After the Rhode Island branch left, there's no hope of really organizing some opposition, and there's no purpose to be in socialist alternative if I disagree with their politics, which I didn't. So I left. So my friends in New Hampshire had left before I did, and they were at a different separate organization. I did stuff with them, and they were kind of lean. They were shopping around for a group. They were leaning towards a group called the IG, the Internationalist Group, who the Internationalist Group are a split from the Spartacus League. I talked about them earlier, my friend Bob, when I worked at the call center. So the IG was a split. They split sometime in the 90s. They have kind of similar politics. They're not quite as batshit crazy as the Sparts are, but kind of similar methodology. My friends in New Hampshire were moving towards that. I went to a bunch of their events. They joined the IG. I was kind of an outsider. I was kind of possibly a prospective member. Then, long story, I don't know, early 2000s, there's this woman named, a revolutionary, early 1900s, named Antoinette Conoco. And really, she was a co-founder, Russian immigrant, co-founder of the U.S. Socialist Party from Eugene Debs. And she was a co-founder of the Communist Party. And she was a co-founder of the Trotskyist movement, kind of unfortunately became kind of an obscure figure, but around 2010 or something, the Sparts had some a celebration in honor of her. So the IG was kind of doing the same thing, and a bunch of us went to her cemetery in Jewish cemetery in Boston. Very moving. We had a little talk and videotape. It was cool. I wrote an article on this for another group, Left Voice, which is kind of a semi-rival Trotskyist group in New York. The IG people were not too happy about me doing this. And anyway, so I kept going to like IG activities and stuff with my friends in New Hampshire. It was kind of eventually one point there was a strike. It was kind of subtly made clear to me they didn't want me anymore. They're a group of about 60 people. And later on, there's a party where I was kind of disinvited to. Okay, whatever. So clearly the IG did not want me. Okay, probably because I wrote the article for Left Voice. And also, they don't want people who've been around the left for a while. I have a lot of friends on Facebook, Left Book. I know a lot of people on the left by now. And they want like young people they can mold and things like that. So anyway, that's it. In the IG, my original criticisms of it weren't so much politically, but organizationally, they're extremely tight. You have to absolutely agree with all their stuff. They're very, very tight, super sectarian. Later on, long story, but I kind of read some of their politics. They have this like, there's a group, the Trotskyist movement, the faction, the Pabloites, which around the 1950s, they believe like Pabloites some kind of original sin, and they have this like intense sectarian. It's complicated, but some of their basic political ideas I kind of came to understand it. I didn't really agree with. I would have liked my friends in New Hampshire I would have loved to organize with them if they wanted to build like an independent New England socialist group. I would have loved to do that. My problem wasn't so much with the IG's politics, but with their organizational structure, when then it became to be their politics. So I get their point. And if I were them, I wouldn't want me around anyway. I kind of get their point, but I miss being in a socialist organization. I miss being in something. One more group, I was invited to join Socialist Action. They're a group which really just split off from, the whole Trotskyist movement is extremely complicated, but there were another Trotskyist group. I've been aware of them for years. I've been aware of them. Some of the opposition people from Socialist Alternative joined Socialist Action. They have somewhat different politics. There was again a split in Socialist Action, formed a group called Socialist Resurgence. They're like third campus. They're, oppose U.S. imperialism is bad, but what about Russia? But what about Syria? I disagree with that. I went to their Trotsky school, what they call Trotsky School in Connecticut. I think it was like 3 years ago now. It was really interesting, but I decided not to join them. I didn't really agree with their politics. One member on Facebook really hated me and lambasted me. That was odd. Anyway, that's it. That's my experience with the Trotskyist movement. And I don't mean any personal offense against anyone. If you're in left-wing politics, you'll sooner come into really heated polemics with people, and that goes with the territory. I don't mean any personal offense against anyone. The vast majority of people on the left are extremely nice, well-meaning people, a few jerks, but most people are really well-meaning. Anyway, I'm not in a group. I've toyed with the idea of trying to start an organization myself, but I don't think I'm a good organizer. For now, I'm making these videos. Anyway, if you enjoy, please like and subscribe. Thank you. Oh, my next video will be on Yemen, on the war in Yemen. Thank you.